May 12, 1944, Leuna, Germany. The sirens came first, then the thunder of engines that seemed to fill the entire sky. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Weber stood in the observation tower of the synthetic oil plant and counted the formations. 20, 30, 40 bomber groups, more than he'd ever seen in a single raid. The American 8th Air Force had arrived with mathematical precision, and somewhere in that moment, between the air raid warning and the first bomb impacts, Weber understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This wasn't just another bombing raid. This was production meeting production, and Germany was losing a war it had already lost in the factories. The numbers didn't lie, even when German propaganda tried to hide them. By the time the smoke cleared over Leuna that afternoon, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, would tell his staff that the technological war had been decided, not by tactics or courage or engineering brilliance, but by something far more terrifying: American industrial capacity operating at a scale Germany could never match. This isn't a story about individual battles or heroic pilots. It's about the moment an entire nation realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an assembly line that never stopped, never slowed, and produced aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Stay with us to see how American factories built 324,750 aircraft, while Germany managed 119,871 total, and how that mathematical reality broke an empire's faith in victory. Long before the first American bombers appeared over German cities, the Luftwaffe believed it owned the skies of Europe. That confidence wasn't arrogance. It was earned. When Hermann Goering stood before his pilots in 1935 and proclaimed the rebirth of German air power, he was unveiling something that had been built in secret for over a decade. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from developing military aircraft, but German engineers had never stopped designing them. They worked through civilian companies, through foreign subsidiaries, through glider clubs that taught the fundamentals of flight to young men who would one day fly combat missions. The Luftwaffe that emerged in the 1930s represented focused, deliberate engineering. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 wasn't improvisation. It was the result of competitive trials where the best designers in Germany submitted their visions for the perfect fighter. Emil Messerschmitt won because his aircraft combined speed, firepower, and handling characteristics that made it superior to anything else flying in Europe at the time. The same methodical approach produced the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, a dive bomber so precise it could place bombs within meters of their targets. German ground troops learned to coordinate their advances with Stuka attacks, turning close air support into a devastating tactical weapon. By 1939, Germany possessed approximately 4,800 military aircraft. More importantly, it possessed the doctrine to use them effectively. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, wasn't just about tanks rolling across borders. It was about aircraft destroying enemy air forces on the ground, bombing rail lines and communication centers, and creating chaos faster than defenders could respond. When the Luftwaffe struck Poland in September 1939, it demonstrated what concentrated air power could accomplish. Polish fighters were destroyed before most of them could take off. Within days, the Polish Air Force ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. 6 months later, France fell the same way. German aircraft appeared over French airfields at dawn, methodically destroying fighters and bombers while they sat parked in neat rows. Luftwaffe commanders studied maps with satisfaction, noting that French air defences had collapsed not from superior numbers, but from superior planning and execution. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The victory in France seemed to confirm everything German strategists believed about air warfare. They had defeated the world's 4th largest air force, using tactics that emphasized quality over quantity, precision over mass production. Goering assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could accomplish whatever the Führer demanded. Britain would be next, and after Britain, perhaps the entire world would understand that German air power was unstoppable. But underneath that confidence lay assumptions that would prove catastrophic. German aircraft production in 1940 totaled 10,826 planes. That seemed impressive until you compared it to what was happening across the Atlantic. In American factories that same year, production lines were beginning to accelerate. Not for war, not yet, but in preparation for something German planners couldn't quite fathom: industrial mobilization on a continental scale. In May 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before the American people and made an announcement that seemed impossible. He called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year. 50,000. In a single year, American factories had never built anything close to that number. In fact, from the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903 through all of 1940, American industry had produced only about 31,800 military aircraft total. Roosevelt was asking for more planes in 1 year than had been built in the entire history of American aviation. When Hitler's advisors briefed him on Roosevelt's speech, they laughed. The Führer was told this was American propaganda, the kind of bluster democracies engaged in when they wanted to appear strong without actually committing to difficult action. Germany's intelligence services reported that American aircraft production in 1939 had been less than 3,000 planes for military use. The idea that American factories could increase production 16-fold in a single year seemed mathematically absurd. But what German analysts failed to understand was that American industrial capacity wasn't limited by what it currently produced. It was limited only by what it chose to produce. The factories that built automobiles could build aircraft. The companies that manufactured farm equipment could retool for military production, and the engineers who had perfected assembly line techniques at Ford and General Motors understood something that German craftsmen had never considered. You could build complex machines the same way you built cars, breaking down every component into standardized, replaceable parts that less skilled workers could assemble with minimal training. The numbers seemed impossible because German production was based on a different philosophy entirely. Each Messerschmitt that rolled out of the Regensburg plant was built by skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. Tolerances were tight, quality control was meticulous, and every aircraft represented hundreds of hours of specialized labor. It was the same approach that had made German precision engineering famous worldwide, but it was also an approach that couldn't scale. American planners looked at aircraft production and saw an industrial problem waiting to be solved. If Ford could build a complete automobile every 69 seconds, surely they could adapt those principles to aircraft. The challenge wasn't whether it could be done. The challenge was organizing the effort fast enough to matter. William Knudsen, former president of General Motors, understood manufacturing at a level few military officers could match. When Roosevelt brought him to Washington to coordinate defense production, Knudsen immediately began identifying bottlenecks. American aircraft companies were small operations that built planes one at a time, each slightly different from the last. That had to change. Standardization became the watchword. If you wanted to build 50,000 planes, you needed every B-17 to use the same engines, the same instruments, the same gun mounts. You needed parts that could be manufactured in Cleveland, Ohio, and assembled in Seattle, Washington without modification. The transformation happened faster than anyone outside America believed possible. By 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union and Japan prepared to strike Pearl Harbor, American factories were already building 26,277 military aircraft per year. Still less than Germany's production, but closing the gap with terrifying speed. And the assembly lines were just warming up. German intelligence officers stationed in neutral countries began sending home reports that seemed increasingly alarming. American aircraft production numbers kept rising. New factories were appearing in cities that had never built planes before. The Willow Run plant outside Detroit was being constructed on a scale that seemed incomprehensible. When completed, it would be the largest factory building in the world. specifically designed to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers using automotive assembly techniques. But in Berlin, these reports were filed away with polite skepticism. Germany was winning. France had fallen. The Low Countries had fallen. The Balkans had fallen. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was proceeding ahead of schedule during its first months. Why should German planners worry about theoretical American production capacity when German armies stood within sight of Moscow? The answer came in December 1941. Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, and suddenly theoretical production capacity became operational reality. Within weeks, Roosevelt was setting new targets: 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943. The numbers escalated faster than German observers could comprehend. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see from thousands of miles away, was the transformation happening across American industry. Automobile plants stopped building cars. In 1941, American factories had produced 3 million civilian automobiles. In 1942, production dropped to only 139 civilian cars. Every assembly line, every machine tool, every skilled worker was being redirected toward military production. Chrysler began building fuselages. General Motors switched from cars to airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard started manufacturing Rolls-Royce engines for the British Royal Air Force under license. And at Willow Run, Ford Motor Company performed what one observer called a miracle. They built a factory that could produce a B-24 Liberator, the most complex bomber in the American arsenal, at a rate approaching 1 aircraft per hour. 1 per hour. 24 bombers per day, the kind of production rate that made German manufacturing look like a cottage industry. By 1942, American military aircraft production had reached 47,836 planes. Germany, stretched thin across multiple fronts, managed 14,700. The gap was widening, but German leadership still believed they could win through superior tactics and battle-hardened pilots. American planes might be numerous, they reasoned, but German pilots had been flying combat missions since the Spanish Civil War. Experience would triumph over numbers. That calculation might have been correct in a conventional war, but World War II had become something unprecedented, a war of attrition where production capacity mattered more than individual skill. Every German pilot shot down represented years of training lost. Every Messerschmitt destroyed took months to replace, but American losses could be made good within weeks. A bomber shot down over Germany on Monday could be replaced by a new aircraft rolling off the assembly line on Friday. The 8th Air Force began operating from England in the summer of 1942. Initial raids were small, tentative probes that tested German defences without committing large forces. Luftwaffe pilots shot them down with relative ease, confirming their belief that American bomber crews were inexperienced and vulnerable. But month by month, the raids grew larger. More bombers, more escorts, more targets struck with increasing precision. By 1943, something had changed. German fighter pilots found themselves facing bomber formations that seemed to replace themselves overnight. A group would destroy 10 B-17 flying fortresses in a single engagement, then face 20 more the next day. The Americans weren't running out of aircraft. They were multiplying them. Oberstleutnant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with multiple victories, described the growing unease among German pilots. In 1942, we would shoot down their bombers and feel we were winning, he later recalled. By 1943, we realized we were fighting an enemy that could afford to lose. Every aircraft we destroyed was already being replaced. We were winning battles, but losing the war of production. The reality was stark. In 1943, American factories produced 85,898 military aircraft. Germany produced 24,807. The Americans were now building aircraft at more than 3 times the German rate, and the gap was still widening. Worse, from Germany's perspective, Those American planes were being flown by crews who had time to train properly because the industrial base could sustain losses during the learning process. German pilot training, by contrast, was collapsing. Fuel shortages meant trainee pilots received fewer flight hours before being sent to combat. The experienced aces who could have trained the next generation were instead flying continuous combat missions because the Luftwaffe couldn't afford to pull them from frontline duty. And every veteran pilot shot down represented not just one loss, but the loss of all the rookies that pilot might have trained. Albert Speer understood the mathematics before most of his colleagues in the German High Command. As Reich Minister of Armaments, he had access to production figures from both sides, compiled by intelligence services and neutral observers. The numbers told a story of inevitability. Germany couldn't win a war of industrial attrition against an enemy that could triple its Timelessot production capacity in 2 years and still had room to grow. In his private meetings with Hitler, Speer tried to communicate the danger. American production wasn't just outpacing German output. It was operating on fundamentally different principles. The Americans had turned aircraft manufacturing into a process industry, like steel production or oil refining. They had standardized everything, automated what could be automated, and trained workers to perform specific tasks with machine-like consistency. A B-24 built in Michigan was identical to a B-24 built in California. Parts were interchangeable, maintenance procedures were standardized, and the supply chain operated with the efficiency of a system designed for maximum throughput. German production, by contrast, remained rooted in craftsmanship traditions that couldn't scale. Even after Speer centralized control and streamlined procedures, German aircraft manufacturers continued to produce variants with slight differences between production runs. Field maintenance crews sometimes discovered that a replacement part from one factory wouldn't fit an aircraft built at another factory, even though both factories were supposedly building the same model. These inefficiencies added up, reducing operational readiness and making it harder to keep damaged aircraft flying. The Allied bombing campaign made everything worse. When the 8th Air Force struck the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt in October 1943, Speer calculated that if the Americans returned for a follow-up raid, German armaments production would be crippled within months. Ball bearings were the kind of bottleneck component that modern industry couldn't function without, and Schweinfurt produced more than half of Germany's supply. But the Americans didn't need to destroy German industry completely. They only needed to degrade it enough that German production could never catch up to American output. By early 1944, the imbalance had become catastrophic. American factories were now producing 96,369 military aircraft per year. Germany, despite Speer's organizational improvements and the use of slave labor from concentration camps, managed only 39,807. The Americans were building aircraft at a rate 2.5 times greater than Germany, and they were doing it while also supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations, with thousands of additional planes through the Lend-Lease program. The Strategic Bombing Survey would later calculate that American production in 1944 exceeded the combined aircraft output of Germany, Japan, and Italy for the entire war. One nation, mobilized for total war production, was outbuilding 3 industrialized empires simultaneously. And, unlike Germany, which had reached the limits of its production capacity, American output still had room to grow. The psychological impact on German forces was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots who had once believed in their own superiority now looked at the sky and saw endless waves of enemy aircraft. Every mission became a calculation of survival rather than victory. Even successful interceptions meant little when the next day brought fresh bomber formations with new crews and new aircraft that had been built while yesterday's battle was still being fought. Hauptmann Werner Dernbrack, flying Messerschmitt 109s out of Jüterbog airfield south of Berlin, described the transformation in his squadron's morale. In 1942, he remembered, they would celebrate shooting down 3 bombers as a significant victory. By 1944, Destroying 10 bombers in a single engagement meant nothing. There would be 15 more tomorrow and 20 the day after that. We stopped counting victories, Dernbrack wrote in his journal. We started counting how many comrades were still alive. The mathematics were crushing German spirit as effectively as the bombs were crushing German industry. Luftwaffe commanders calculated that they needed to shoot down American bombers at a rate of 70 per raid to make the losses unsustainable. They occasionally achieved that number during particularly fierce engagements, such as the second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, where 60 B-17 bombers were destroyed. But the Americans absorbed the losses, replaced the aircraft within weeks, and returned in even greater strength. The attrition rate that should have broken the 8th Air Force instead served as proof that production had become more important than tactics. German intelligence services tried to track American production facilities, compiling lists of factories, assembly plants, and component manufacturers. The scope of American industry was staggering. Boeing facilities in Seattle, Douglas plants in Long Beach and Oklahoma City, consolidated factories in Fort Worth and San Diego, North American Aviation in Kansas City and Dallas, Lockheed in Burbank, Republic on Long Island, Grumman, Bell, Vultee, Martin, scores of major manufacturers, each with multiple plants, supported by thousands of subcontractors producing engines, instruments, radios, and weapons. And those were just the airframe manufacturers. Pratt & Whitney built engines. Curtiss-Wright built propellers. Bendix built electrical systems. Each component of an American aircraft represented its own industrial ecosystem, designed for maximum production efficiency. When a German intelligence analyst compiled the complete list of American aviation industry facilities, the document ran to hundreds of pages. Attempting to bomb them all would require more aircraft than the Luftwaffe possessed, and even if they could reach American territory, the factories were so dispersed that destroying them all was impossible. Contrast that with Germany's concentrated production. The Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, the Focke-Wulf factory at Marienburg, the Junkers works at Dessau. These were the heart of German aircraft production, and they were all within range of Allied bombers. When the Americans struck Regensburg and Schweinfurt simultaneously in August 1943, they proved they could hit German aviation industry at will. The fact that they sustained heavy losses doing so was irrelevant when those losses could be replaced within days. The May 12th, 1944 raid on Leuna marked a turning point not because it was the largest raid or the most destructive, but because it represented the moment when German industrial leaders realized the war was mathematically unwinnable. Speer had been warning Hitler about American production capacity for months, but the Führer dismissed the concerns. Germany, Hitler insisted, had superior technology, superior pilots, and superior will. Those advantages would compensate for any numerical disadvantage. But on May 12th, Speer could point to concrete evidence that technology and will didn't matter. The synthetic oil plant at Leuna was essential to German aviation fuel production. Without it, the Luftwaffe couldn't fly regardless of how many aircraft remained operational. The Americans had struck it with overwhelming force, dropping thousands of tons of bombs with precision that left the facility in ruins. And they would return, again and again, until German fuel production stopped entirely. 4 days after the raid, Speer wrote in his diary that May 12th was the day the technological war was decided. Not because German engineers couldn't build excellent aircraft, not because German pilots weren't skilled and brave, but because American industry had reached a point where it could sustain any level of casualties and still maintain numerical superiority. Germany could not win a war of attrition against an enemy whose production capacity exceeded German output by a rough-to-the-life factor of 3 to 1. The breaking point approached faster than most German commanders anticipated. Every month brought new intelligence reports about American production. 90,000 aircraft in 1944, then 95,000, then 96,000. The final tally would show that American factories had produced more combat aircraft in 1944 alone than Germany had produced during the entire war to that point. And the Americans weren't just building bombers. Fighter production was equally staggering. P-51 Mustangs, arguably the best propeller-driven fighter of the war, rolled off assembly lines at North American Aviation at a rate approaching 500 per month by late 1944. These weren't experimental prototypes or handcrafted machines. They were standardized production aircraft, each identical to the last, each capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. When German pilots first encountered Mustangs over the Reich in early 1944, they assumed the Americans had finally managed to extend the range of their P-47 Thunderbolts through drop tanks. The reality was worse. The Mustang had been designed from the start as a long-range escort fighter, with internal fuel capacity that gave it combat radius exceeding 500 miles. American pilots could now protect bomber formations throughout their entire mission, eliminating the window of vulnerability that had once allowed Luftwaffe fighters to attack with relative impunity. The Mustang represented everything about American production that German aviation couldn't match. It was a superb design, but its excellence came from practical engineering rather than perfectionism. The airframe was built using modular construction techniques that allowed rapid assembly. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was manufactured under license with American production methods that delivered reliability without requiring the skilled craftsmanship British engine builders considered essential. And most importantly, North American aviation could build Mustangs faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. By summer 1944, German fighter pilots faced a grim reality every time they took off. The skies over Germany were filled with American aircraft, and those aircraft were supported by an industrial base that could replace any losses overnight. Luftwaffe losses, by contrast, were becoming irreplaceable. Fuel shortages meant experienced pilots flew fewer training missions, new pilots arrived at combat units with minimal flight time, and maintenance crews struggled to keep damaged aircraft operational, using salvaged parts and improvised repairs. The qualitative advantage German pilots had enjoyed in 1940 had evaporated by 1944. American pilots now had more flight training hours than their German counterparts. They flew aircraft that were equal or superior to German types. And they enjoyed the psychological security of knowing that if they were shot down, another pilot in another aircraft would take their place tomorrow. German pilots had no such reassurance. Every loss was permanent. Every damaged aircraft might never fly again because replacement parts were stuck in a bomb-damaged factory or lost in transit when an Allied fighter strafed a supply train. The production war extended beyond aircraft to every aspect of aerial combat. Ammunition, fuel, spare parts, training equipment, pilot instruction, all of these depended on industrial capacity. American aviation units received a steady flow of everything they needed because the supply chain never broke down. German units made do with whatever reached them, rationing ammunition because factories couldn't produce enough, grounding aircraft because fuel was too scarce for training flights, and sending half-trained pilots into combat because the experienced instructors had been killed months earlier. In his comprehensive report to Hitler in June 1944, Speer laid out the mathematics with brutal honesty. American aircraft production, he wrote, had reached levels that made German victory impossible through air power. The Luftwaffe could not prevent Allied bombers from reaching their targets. German factories could not produce enough fighters to counter the American numerical advantage, and even if production somehow doubled overnight, fuel shortages would prevent the aircraft from flying. The war in the air was lost, Speer concluded, and the war on the ground would follow inevitably. Hitler, still clinging to faith in German technological superiority, ordered development of jet aircraft that would sweep Allied bombers from the sky. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was indeed superior to any propeller-driven fighter in existence. But German industry could only produce approximately 1,400 Me 262 aircraft before the war ended, and chronic fuel shortages meant many of those jets never flew operational missions. The Americans, when they finally entered jet production in the war's final months, demonstrated they could build jets using the same mass production techniques that had given them dominance in conventional aircraft. Quality and innovation meant nothing when they couldn't be produced in quantity. The June 1944 Mariana Turkey shoot demonstrated the complete reversal of air power balance. Japanese naval aviation, which had once rivaled the Luftwaffe in skill and equipment, encountered American carrier aircraft in overwhelming numbers. More than 300 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day, while American losses were minimal. The battle proved what German commanders already knew. When one side could replace losses faster than the other side could inflict them, numerical superiority became decisive, regardless of individual pilot skill or aircraft performance. For German pilots still, fighting over the Reich, the Mariana Turkey shoot was a preview of their own future. American production had given the Allies absolute air superiority, and no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome mathematics. The best German pilots, the aces with dozens or hundreds of victories, were being killed because they had to fly constantly while their opponents could rotate fresh crews through combat zones. Exhaustion killed as effectively as enemy fire, and exhaustion was another form of attrition that favored the side with unlimited resources. By autumn 1944, Luftwaffe fighters were increasingly grounded not because of combat losses, but because of fuel shortages and parts unavailability. American bombers had targeted synthetic fuel plants with systematic precision, reducing German aviation fuel production to a trickle. Aircraft that would have been repairable sat in hangars because specific replacement parts weren't available. Pilots with combat experience sat idle because there wasn't enough fuel for training flights or even ferrying aircraft between airfields. The irony was crushing. German engineers had designed some of the war's best aircraft. German pilots were among the most skilled and experienced in the world. German tactical doctrine emphasized concentration of force and aggressive engagement, but none of that mattered when the enemy could build 3 aircraft for every one Germany produced and train 3 pilots for every German pilot who graduated from flying school. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The final months of 1944 brought a desperate attempt to reverse the production imbalance through dispersal and hidden facilities. Speer-ordered aircraft manufacturing moved underground, into mines and caves where Allied bombers couldn't reach them. The Mittelbau-Dora complex, built largely by concentration camp slave labor, became the site of underground factories producing Me-262 jets and V-2 rockets. Working conditions were horrific, with prisoners dying from malnutrition, disease, and industrial accidents. But even with slave labor and hidden production sites, German output continued falling because the raw materials needed for aircraft manufacturing, aluminum, rubber, high-octane fuel, couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities when the supply chain was under constant attack. American production, by contrast, faced no such constraints. Factories operated around the clock in 3 shifts. Raw materials arrived by train and truck from suppliers who had never been bombed. Workers lived in nearby housing developments built specifically to support defense plants. Women, who had been excluded from German military production, made up a significant percentage of the American aviation workforce. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda image. She represented millions of American women who learned to rivet aluminum sheet metal, install hydraulic systems, and assemble aircraft components with the same precision male workers had achieved. The gender disparity in workforce mobilization revealed another fundamental difference between American and German industrial philosophy. Hitler had opposed putting German women in factories, believing it would undermine traditional values and weaken the nation's moral character. That ideology cost Germany millions of potential workers at precisely the moment when industrial output determined survival. American women, by contrast, flooded into defense plants by the hundreds of thousands. By 1944, women constituted nearly 40% of the aviation industry workforce, and their productivity matched or exceeded that of male workers performing the same tasks. The wage structure also differed significantly. American defense contractors paid relatively high wages to attract skilled workers, and those wages translated into consumer spending that supported the broader economy. German defense production relied increasingly on slave labor from conquered territories and concentration camps, workers who received minimal food and no wages. While slave labor appeared cheaper on paper, it was actually less efficient because malnourished, brutalized workers couldn't maintain the productivity levels of properly treated free labor. Sabotage was also a constant problem in facilities using slave workers, with deliberately damaged components making it through quality control and causing aircraft failures. By December 1944, the production gap had become a chasm. American factories had built 96,369 military aircraft that year. Germany managed 39,807, and many of those aircraft never became operational due to fuel shortages, missing components, or damage during Allied bombing raids on airfields and rail lines. The ratio had shifted from 2-1 in America's favor in 1942 to nearly 3-1 by the end of 1944. The human cost of this production imbalance fell heaviest on German aircrew. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who flew throughout the war, kept a diary that chronicled the deterioration of German air power. In 1942, his entries described successful missions, squadron camaraderie, and confidence in eventual victory. By 1944, the diary had become a chronicle of attrition. Friends killed, aircraft destroyed on the ground, missions scrubbed due to fuel shortages. The slow realization that courage and skill meant nothing against an enemy that could afford unlimited losses. Nock described a mission in December 1944 where his unit managed to shoot down 7 American bombers, a significant victory by any measure. But as his formation landed, he learned that 3 of his squadron mates had been killed, 2 more were missing, and 5 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The Americans, he knew, would replace those 7 bombers within days. His squadron might not replace the lost pilots for months, if ever. "This is what losing feels like," he wrote. "We win every battle and lose the war anyway." The final production figures told the story with mathematical finality. From 1939 through 1945, American industry produced 324,750 military aircraft. Germany produced 119,871. The Americans built nearly 3 times as many planes as Germany, and they did it while also producing ships, tanks, trucks, and ammunition in quantities that staggered German observers. When captured German officers were shown American production facilities after the war, their reactions ranged from disbelief to resignation. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who had commanded Luftwaffe fighter forces, toured the Willow Run plant and stood silent for several minutes, watching B-24 bombers roll off the assembly line. He finally turned to his American escort and said, "You didn't defeat us with tactics or technology. You buried us with production. We never had a chance against this." The truth of that statement extended beyond aircraft. American industry had produced 297,000 military aircraft, not counting civilian aircraft or trainers. They had built 193,000 artillery pieces when Germany produced 160,000. They had manufactured 86,000 tanks compared to Germany's 67,000. And crucially, they had done all of this while maintaining civilian production at levels that kept the American economy growing throughout the war. German civilians had endured rationing, shortages, and declining living standards from the war's beginning. American civilians experienced some rationing of specific commodities like rubber and gasoline, but overall living standards actually improved during the war years because defense production created millions of jobs and increased wages. The American economy grew by approximately 80% between 1940 and 1944. The German economy, despite Speer's organizational improvements, contracted as Allied bombing and resource shortages took their toll. The philosophical difference between the 2 production systems came down to fundamentally different conceptions of industrial warfare. German military leaders had prepared for a short war where technological superiority and tactical brilliance would deliver quick victories before economic factors became decisive. They had studied the lessons of World War I, where Germany had been defeated by British naval blockade and economic exhaustion, and they believed modern tactics, particularly blitzkrieg, could prevent a repeat of that slow strangulation. But American military planners, particularly those around Roosevelt, understood that modern industrial war favored the side that could mobilize the largest resource base most effectively. Size mattered, raw materials mattered, and, most importantly, the ability to transform industrial capacity from civilian to military production without destroying the economy in the process. That was the decisive factor. America possessed all of these advantages and exploited them with systematic precision. The German response to American production advantage revealed the limitations of technological determinism. Yes, Germany produced the Me-262 jet fighter years before the Allies had comparable aircraft. Yes, German engineers developed rockets, guided missiles, and other advanced weapons. But none of those innovations could be produced in sufficient quantity to affect the war's outcome. The Me-262 was superior to any Allied fighter, but with only 1,400 produced compared to over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, numerical superiority trumped technological edge. This lesson was driven home repeatedly during the final year of the war. Every German technological advance, from improved radar to better armor, from jet engines to rocket-powered interceptors, arrived too late and in too small numbers to matter. American production had created a situation where Germany would need to produce 10 times as many aircraft just to achieve parity, and German industrial capacity couldn't reach even half of American output levels. The Luftwaffe's collapse in early 1945 was the inevitable result of years of production imbalance. By February 1945, German fighter units were flying only a handful of missions per week due to fuel shortages. Many aircraft sat unused because there was no fuel to fly them. Pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience were assigned to ground units because keeping them in the air consumed fuel that could be used for more critical missions, if such missions existed. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Luftwaffe was able to mount only token resistance. Hundreds of aircraft remained in various states of repair across Germany, but without fuel, without spare parts, without trained ground crews, they were just expensive debris. The pilots who had once dominated European skies now watched American and British aircraft fly overhead with impunity, knowing that the war was lost not because German aviators lacked courage, but because German factories couldn't compete with American production capacity. The final accounting was sobering for anyone who believed in the romance of aerial combat. Between 1939 and 1945, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 85,000 aircraft to all causes: combat losses, accidents, and ground destruction. American factories built more than 85,000 fighters alone during the same period, not counting bombers, transports, trainers, or any other aircraft types. Germany was losing aircraft faster than it could build replacements, while America was building aircraft faster than they could be deployed to combat theaters. The strategic implications extended beyond World War II. The Korean War and Vietnam War would both demonstrate that production capacity remained a critical factor in modern warfare. The Cold War arms race between the United States and Soviet Union was fundamentally a competition of industrial output, each side trying to build more missiles, more submarines, more aircraft than the other. The lesson learned from World War II production battles, that industrial capacity matters more than individual weapon superiority, would shape military planning for generations. For the German officers who survived the war, the memory of American production capacity remained vivid. They had entered the war believing that German engineering, excellence and tactical superiority would compensate for any numerical disadvantage. They had learned, through bitter experience, that mathematics don't care about courage or skill. 300,000 American aircraft versus 120,000 German aircraft wasn't a battle statistic. It was a verdict delivered by assembly lines that never stopped running. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs, reflected on the production disparity with unusual candor for a former Nazi official. He acknowledged that Germany had lost the war in the factories long before losing it on the battlefield. American industrial mobilization, he wrote, was the most decisive factor in World War II's outcome. We were fighting soldiers. They were fighting with assembly lines. No amount of German technological innovation could overcome that fundamental imbalance. The aircraft production differential also highlighted the importance of strategic planning and resource allocation. American military leaders had recognized early that air power would be decisive, and they had allocated resources accordingly. Factories were converted, workers were trained, supply chains were established, all before the United States officially entered the war. By the time Pearl Harbor brought America into active combat, the industrial base was already ramping up toward wartime production levels. Germany, by contrast, had delayed total mobilization until it was too late. Hitler had resisted putting the economy on a full wartime footing until 1943, believing that maintaining civilian morale required avoiding the kind of total war economy that had characterized World War I. That decision cost Germany 2 critical years of maximum production capacity, years when American factories were already operating at full capacity around the clock. The irony is that German propaganda had consistently mocked American industrial capability. Göring had famously claimed that Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades, not the kind of precision military equipment needed for modern warfare. Hitler had dismissed Roosevelt's production goals as propaganda and fantasy. Both men would learn, too late, that American industry was far more capable than they had imagined. When American forces liberated Nazi concentration camps in spring 1945, they found evidence of the desperate measures Germany had taken to maintain production. Slave laborers worked in underground factories, producing components for Me-2 jets and V-2 rockets under conditions that killed thousands. The moral obscenity of using slave labor was compounded by the industrial inefficiency. Workers who are starved, beaten, and worked to death don't produce quality components. Sabotage was endemic. Production rates were a fraction of what free, well-fed workers achieved in American plants. The comparison was stark. American factory workers earned good wages, had access to adequate food and housing, and were motivated by a combination of patriotism and economic self-interest. They produced aircraft at rates that seemed impossible to German observers. Meanwhile, German slave laborers, forced to work under threat of death, produced aircraft at rates that steadily declined as workers weakened and died. The moral system that treated workers as human beings outproduced the system that treated them as disposable resources. Justice and efficiency coincided. The final tally of aircraft production also revealed the extent to which American industry had armed not just American forces but the entire Allied coalition. Thousands of American aircraft went to Britain through Lend-Lease. Thousands more went to the Soviet Union. American factories supplied aircraft to Free French units, to Canadian squadrons, to Chinese forces fighting Japan. The production capacity wasn't just sufficient for American needs. It was sufficient to supply an entire coalition against multiple enemies on multiple continents. Germany, by contrast, had to provide aircraft to its allies, further straining limited production capacity. Italian forces needed German aircraft when Italian production proved inadequate. Romanian units flew German types. Hungarian air units relied on Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs. Every aircraft diverted to an ally was one fewer aircraft for German units, creating a zero-sum allocation problem that American planners never faced. The psychological impact of the production imbalance affected military decision-making at the highest levels. Hitler's increasingly erratic strategic decisions in the war's final years reflected, in part, the desperation of a leader who understood that time was running out. Every month that passed brought more American aircraft to Europe. Every delay in achieving decisive results gave American factories more time to produce the weapons that would overwhelm German defenses. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's last major offensive in the West, an attempt to split Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp before American production capacity could bring overwhelming force to bear. The offensive initially succeeded because bad weather grounded Allied aircraft, temporarily neutralizing American air superiority. But when the weather cleared, American air power descended on German forces with devastating effect. Hundreds of Allied aircraft attacked German columns, destroying vehicles, disrupting supply lines, and proving once again that control of the air was decisive in modern warfare. German commanders watching the Battle of the Bulge unfold understood that even temporary tactical success couldn't overcome strategic reality. The Americans had lost aircraft during the offensive, but those aircraft were already being replaced by fresh planes arriving from the United States. German losses, by contrast, were permanent. Every tank destroyed, every fighter shot down, every truck disabled represented a loss that could not be replaced. The offensive failed not because German tactics were flawed, but because German resources were exhausted while American resources seemed infinite. In the war's final weeks, as Allied forces converged on Berlin from east and west, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist. A few aircraft still flew, but organized resistance had collapsed. American and British bombers flew over Germany in broad daylight without encountering significant opposition. The skies that German fighters had once defended with such ferocity now belonged entirely to the Allies, a tangible symbol of production capacity, defeating tactical excellence. The surrender in May 1945 ended combat operations, but the impact of the production imbalance continued reverberating through the post-war world. American aircraft manufacturers, having proven their capacity to build tens of thousands of complex machines per year, dominated civilian aviation after the war. Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, all of these companies used lessons learned during wartime production to become leaders in commercial aviation. The DC-3 transport became the DC-4 airliner. The B-29 bomber's pressurization technology led to high-altitude commercial aircraft. German aviation industry, by contrast, was dismantled by the Allies. Factories were destroyed or converted to other purposes. Engineers were recruited by American, British, French, and Soviet programs. The expertise that had built the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters was dispersed to the victorious powers. Germany would not produce military aircraft again for decades, and when it did, the industry operated under Allied supervision using Allied designs. The lesson of aircraft production in World War II influenced military planning throughout the Cold War and beyond. American defense policy emphasized maintaining an industrial base capable of rapid expansion in wartime. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a wartime slogan. It became a strategic principle, the idea that American industrial capacity was a weapon as important as any aircraft or tank. That principle shaped procurement decisions, base construction, and alliance relationships for generations. For the German officers and pilots who had witnessed American production capacity overwhelm Luftwaffe resistance, the memory remained painful decades after the war. They had fought with skill and courage, but skill and courage weren't enough against an enemy that could replace every loss overnight. The personal tragedy of individual airmen, young men dying in burning aircraft, was compounded by the larger tragedy of a strategic miscalculation that sent them into unwinnable battles. The final number, 324,750 American aircraft versus 119,871 German aircraft, represented more than just production statistics. It represented the victory of mass production over craftsmanship, quantity over quality, industrial capacity over tactical brilliance. Germany had built excellent aircraft, flown by skilled pilots using effective tactics. But excellence wasn't enough when the enemy could build 3 planes for every one Germany produced. The story of aircraft production in World War II is ultimately a story about choices and their consequences. America chose to mobilize its full industrial capacity, to bring women into factories, to standardize production processes, and to treat aircraft as products to be manufactured efficiently rather than as individual works of engineering art. Germany chose to maintain traditional manufacturing methods, to exclude women from defense production, and to believe that quality would triumph over quantity. Both sides were committed to their choices. Only one side was proven right. When the last German aircraft surrendered in May 1945, it marked the end of an era when individual skill and tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantage. The age of industrial warfare had arrived, and its first verdict was delivered by assembly lines in Michigan, California, and Washington that never stopped producing the aircraft that filled the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe hadn't just been defeated. It had been buried under an avalanche of American production that no amount of German courage or innovation could stop. The legacy endures in modern military thinking. Production capacity, industrial base, supply chain resilience, these aren't just economic concepts. They're strategic weapons as important as any missile or fighter jet. World War II proved that a nation's factories can be as decisive as its armies, and that lesson has shaped warfare ever since. 300,000 American aircraft didn't just win a war. They demonstrated that in modern conflict, the side that can outproduce its enemy will ultimately prevail, regardless of individual battles won or lost along the way. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.